All right, maybe we'll kick off. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jared from Bank Australia, and I'll be the host of today's panel. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining us today from Wimmera country on the Mornington Peninsula, south of Melbourne. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and same with the traditional owners on the land where all of us are meeting from today. And if you'd like to post in the chat box which country you're joining from, that'd be great. So thanks for registering today. I'm going to introduce the people that we'll be chatting to, all things conservation. First up, we've got well, myself. I'm the strategy and planning manager at Bank Australia, and I look after our conservation work and some of our sustainability initiatives as well. So we've also got Fiona Nixon, who's our head of strategy at Bank Australia, Brendan Ferran, who's the CEO of Greening Australia, one of our partners who help manage our conservation reserve. Fiona Copley from Trust for Nature, we're also one of our partners on the reserve, and Darren Griffin from the BGLC, the Barengi Gadjin Land Council, who's playing an increasingly important role in the way of managing the reserve going forward. I can see, well, I know that I've got half a beard, and that some people are probably wondering why. I'll get to that at the end of the session, so you'll have to hang around to find out about that. I'd like to encourage everybody to ask questions. There's a Q&A box and there's a chat box. If you could use the Q&A box for your questions, that'd be great. So we might start off with one for Fiona Nixon. Why did Bank Australia purchase a conservation property?
Thanks, Jared, and thanks so much for coming along today. We're really excited to talk about conservation, and it was a little bit surprising to see how many people registered for something with the name with a bank in the title, but hopefully we can talk more about conservation today than banking. So look, back in 2008, Bank Australia had already started on its sustainability pathway, and the bank had already introduced some sort of market-leading products like a green home loan and a green car loan into the market, and it was trying to figure out how else it could have a positive impact. And the visionary of this approach, Rowan Dowland, actually had a Trust for Nature newsletter fall open on his desk one day, and it had a property that was available for sale through the Trust's circular fund. And it really sparked some thinking for him about, wow, imagine if we actually had our own conservation property, imagine what we could do. And it wasn't really about offsets, it was more about the fact that this was a high value conservation property that needed someone to take guardianship of it and to realise its potential and to protect what was already there. And so he went out for a visit, and the very charming Adam from Trust for Nature, and very passionate conservation champion in the Wimmera region of Victoria, took Rowan on a tour of the Wimmera property. And I think by the end of that visit, Rowan's mind was made up that the bank had a future in helping to advance conservation in the West Wimmera and in Australia more generally. And so Wimmera was the first purchase, and in the subsequent years we purchased another 5 properties, all in the same area. And the intention for the first phase was really to understand what kind of restoration needed to happen on those properties. And we did that. We've always worked in partnership. We're not conservation experts, so we've always worked in collaboration with the local community, plus conservation experts to help us do that. So that was really the start of it. And it's fantastic to have our partners involved in this webinar too. And I know Fiona Copley from Trust for Nature has known this property since the very beginning. Yes, I'm sure she has some perspectives as well.
Yeah, it's been great working with the bank on these properties. And yeah, we did have it originally as part of our revolving fund where we purchase properties and on-sell them to people like the bank and individual landholders to look after them with a Trust for Nature covenant on, which protects it forever. It's really exciting.
I think oh, sorry, you are moving on to the next question. I was just going to add that ownership of the properties is really important to us because it gives us control over what we're doing, but it also has been really important that it helps. We've been able to help our employees and our customers feel part of something, and being customer owned means that, you know, each one of our customers and our employees, because they're all customers too, actually have, you know, they own a part of these conservation reserves.
That's maybe a good segue to go into a bit more detail on some of the organisations we've got represented today. What do you do on our conservation reserve? Maybe we'll start with you, Fiona, since you've already started on that.
So Trust for Nature has a really special role on the conservation reserve. For people that don't know, Trust for Nature is an independent organisation, and we put conservation covenants on private property. So for each person that has a conservation covenant on their property, it essentially becomes their own personal little national park. So it has to be protected forever, and it's an agreement that is registered on title, and it's a legal thing, so it means it stays on forever for you and for each subsequent landowner. And it means that essentially it's managed for conservation. The bank does this really well. They have a bit more resources than most individual people do, but everyone that owns native vegetation can contact Trust for Nature and see if they'd like to do a similar thing. So we do this with the bank. We ensure that each piece of their land is protected forever, and we work with them. We write them a management plan to ensure that they understand what it is to be done. With the bank, we also write a work plan in conjunction with Greening Australia. They're a strong partner in this reserve as well. And I'm sure Brendan will talk about that. And so that we can do actual conservation work on the land. The land isn't necessarily in fantastic condition. When the bank buys it, it might have been partially cleared. And so we can help them manage it so that it improves the value. It just doesn't stay static. It improves the value over time for conservation.
Would you like to elaborate on that, Brendan, from your perspective?
Thanks, Jared, and hi everyone, coming to you from Yorta country, which is up on the Murray River region of Victoria. So in answering that question, I'll just take a moment to explain Greening Australia. So we've been around for 40 years next year, and we operate in each part of the country, but we largely work in the areas that have been affected by overclearance or land degradation since European settlement. So just to put that into context, there's about 90 million hectares of land that have been cleared since European settlement in Australia. And our vision is healthy and productive landscapes where people and nature thrive. And inherent to that is a belief that to achieve that outcome is economies, communities and environments need to be connected in ways that benefit them all, which is why we work with Bank Australia and Trust for Nature on the Conservation Reserve. That fits into a overarching landscape plan that we're part of called Habitat 141, which is the 141st line of longitude, which pretty much runs along the South Australia and Victorian border. And there we work on the Wimmera property with, as Fiona said, Trust for Nature, and what we do is manage the reserve for conservation purposes. So our local team leader, the awesome Jess Gardner, if you have met her, you know she is awesome, plans and delivers on-ground work where we restore habitat, we do seed collection, weed management, and we plant a mix of local species, implement the fire plan, which I'm sure will be a question that comes up later. And think about all the activities that we can do that value add for wildlife and habitat installations. We also bring other resources into the project. This is a partnership after all, and we do things like propose science-led projects. One of the projects that we're working on at the moment is climate-ready restoration, which we're trialling on the reserve, and that uses different seeds of different provenances. It's only in its first year, so we can't really tell you much about that yet. But importantly, as I said, we've got people like Jess who are out in the community managing the local relationships and providing employment opportunities as well. So it's very much part of Greening Australia's plans to plant 500 million trees across the country by 2030 across 330,000 hectares. Thanks, Jared.
Great, it's such an ambitious vision, and yeah, really excited to be a part of it, Bank Australia. Over to you, Darren. Would you like to give us your take on it?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me along, and thanks everyone for joining. Just like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. I'm Wadawurrung country at the moment. The traditional owners I work for, which is the traditional owners of the Bank Australia reserves, and any traditional owners watching today. So my name's Darren. I'm an archaeologist. I work for Barengi Gadjin Land Council. So we represent the traditional owners of the Jawa, Jali, Wagaya, Wotjobalek, and Yapgalt peoples. So these were all the peoples who were moved onto Ebenezer Mission, which is on the Wimmera River near Antwerp. And they're the traditional owners of the area where the Bank Australia reserves are. So Brandon was just talking about Fiona. So we have a good relationship with Fiona that goes back many years. We've worked on many properties with her before. And she mentioned the Bank Australia properties and talked about getting a cultural heritage survey done, which is what we feel is a very important starting point for all properties to understand how best to manage the cultural resources on their property as well as natural. We don't get much of a chance to do it on private property. A lot of the work we do is on public land. So it was great to try this out with Fiona and Bank Australia to do a cultural survey, and then that feeds into, like you said, the fire strategy and doing cultural burns and protecting the cultural heritage resources.
Thanks for that overview, Darren. It's such an exciting, for us, an exciting element of the conservation reserve is to be learning like the depth of history and land management practices that can be deployed on the land. It's so great for us to be working with you on this. Maybe we'll go over to the next question now. Over to Brendan. What does conservation have to do with climate change?
In short, Jared, everything. One of the amazing things about conservation and climate change is we have most of the answers around how to deal with some of the more extreme macro level issues of climate change. And nature is a wonderful way of storing carbon, improving water quality, increasing biodiversity, all the things that we need to respond to climate change. And I remember very, very early in my time at Greening Australia, I was at a conference. I must have only been there for about a week or so. And it was a sort of industry style, been at Greening Australia for a week or so. It was an industry style conference where people were walking around asking questions, and people came to our stand, and one of our then employees was asked, oh, what's your technology for carbon mitigation? And he said, oh, biosequestration. Biosequestration's our technology. And this person asking the question had a clipboard and said, biosequestration, never heard of it. What is it? And he said, oh, look, I won't go into the ins and outs of it, but basically it's a technology that's been proven over 5 million years. And, and that's basically talking about the capacity of nature to store carbon and turn it into, things like oxygen and so on and so on. So, conservation has a lot to do with climate change, and the reason why we're trying to increase the level of conservation in response to climate change is we've lost a lot of the services that Mother Nature or nature provides to us through things like overclearance. And as I said in my opening comments, there's 90 million hectares of land that's been cleared since the late 1700s and here in Australia. And, you know, one of the good things that we know from scientists is we don't need to reinstate those 90 million hectares to get back all the benefits that they previously provided. We can reinstate about 30% and accrue many of the benefits that we had from those 90 million hectares. So to your question, it has everything to do with climate change. We have all the tools at our disposal, and it's just really a matter of forming more partnerships like this at a scale that can really make a big difference. So specifically to something like the Conservation Reserve, the Bank Australia Conservation Reserve, we're about providing pockets of vegetation which are critical in providing vital refuge for plants and animals that are facing dangers in the landscape, but also moving through that landscape. As the climate changes and as the local landscape changes, it's really important that you keep the existing areas in really good condition, and adding more around those areas is really critical to finding the best ways in which we can help nature adapt. So as I said there before, wildlife moves around, it finds safe places in extreme situations, and effectively we're looking at creating an insurance policy in plant species that may be lost through fire or clearing or changing rainfall patterns. So what's also really important here is BA didn't buy this reserve just because it was for sale. They bought this reserve because it fitted into a really big picture from a conservation point of view. It's got really unique values on their own, but that fits into a broader connectivity landscape, as I said there before, which both Trust for Nature and Greening Australia work across, called Habitat 141. So, you know, strategically acquiring these reserves within that landscape, allowing that interaction to happen is really, really important. So for the third time, Jared, I'll just be saying that, you know, conservation has everything to do with climate change.
Great response. And I think, yeah, it's really great. It's really refreshing, I guess, to hear this approach taken more and more now, where we're looking for nature-based responses to emissions reduction, but also acknowledging that we've got a landscape that's going to need to be ready for quite a big shock over the next few centuries, and building that resilience. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add to that question before we move on?
Yeah, I was just thinking a lot of the great thing about conservation is we've found that complex habitats that have a lot of different types of species, so trees and shrubs and ground cover, all of those things sequester a lot of carbon as well. So it's not just, a lot of people think trees when you talk about sequestering carbon through the environment. It's also all those other little things that cover the ground and stop surface evaporation of water, which also provides a lot of these little habitats for the more threatened species we have. A lot of our threatened species have really niche requirements, which is why they're threatened. And so providing that through conservation helps them survive through climate change. It's no secret that a lot of our plant animals are moving south with climate change as the atmosphere warms. And so providing these, just to expand on what Brendan said, this connectivity, corridors through the landscape, both pockets, but also pathways through by joining large blocks together, often through roadside vegetation, but even through paddock trees, are enormously important for protecting species as they're pushed south, really, by climate change. So conservation really protects species, but also protects the overall climate through its carbon absorption. The two play into each other quite strongly.
Mm. Absolutely.
Jared, I might just add from a different perspective, I guess, that, you know, as a bank that really takes climate change very seriously, we're currently sort of redoing our strategy for climate. And I think it's, you know, there is a whole lot of effort that desperately needs to go into decarbonising the economy and our energy sources and our transport. But at the same time, you know, we also think that there's a lot of work to do on, you know, regeneration and building a world for, you for afterwards, and trying to picture a world for how we want to live afterwards. And nature and having access to biodiverse systems is going to be an important, really critical part of that world after. Food security, water security, all of those kinds of things that people need as well as animals. Conservation has a role to play in that, in trying to envisage that, because conservation is not a short-term game. It's not a short-term fix. It's really about putting in place things for the far future and trying to see as far ahead as we can.
Really good point, Fiona. Definitely such an exciting element for the way that we're framing our climate vision going forward. Might just move on to the next question now. I'm keen to direct this one to you, Darren, first up. How are traditional owners involved in our reserve, and why do you feel this work's really important?
Yeah, thanks. Like I said, the traditional owners of this area, the Watchabolek Nations, the group that I work for, represented by Barengi Gadjin Land Council. So we initially did a survey. Like I said, we had a few chats with Fiona about what we could do and what the importance of doing cultural surveys. Like I said, it's an important start for all people managing the land, to know what cultural heritage they have on their land, to have that connection with the traditional owners, and to kind of learn about the way traditional owners manage the land for tens of thousands of years, and how we can work together in the modern era. So we did a cultural survey there in 2018, and we found a few culturally modified trees. So these are trees that were culturally modified by the traditional owners, we found about 5 on the Wimmera property, and 1 on Oskanuk, that one. So they're basically places where bark has been cut out of trees used for specific purposes. So traditionally, Aboriginal people use bark for a whole range of things. It's probably their most well-used material. And you don't see a lot of it in the landscape now, because so many trees were cut down when the Europeans moved in. So it's quite interesting on Wimmera that we found a few, and a few of the ones that we did find, some of them had been ring barked. So I think a lot of there wasn't very many mature trees left. I think a lot of them had obviously been cut down a long time ago. And the reason some of them survived is the trees survived the ring barking, but it looked like they were deliberately hit where there was a cultural modification. So since then, and like I said, we've identified some other areas that might be sensitive as well, and all that information fed into the fire plan, the fire management plan. So, and it's really important that we understand where those places are, so that we can protect them when they're having burns. But also, it meant that the traditional owners were involved in putting together that plan and doing cultural burns on the property. So, like I said earlier, that it's important to get the sort of knowledge of the traditional owners and how they manage the land for so long, and work together. And cultural burns, I think, is a really important way of doing that. We've got a cultural burns officer, we've got a natural resource manager, and they were both, and also a ranger team, and they were all involved in the cultural burns on the property, and all the ones that will be coming up as well. And in addition to that, we're hoping to try and get some of the Jali Wagaya names back, the traditional names back into the landscape as well. That's another really important thing. So some of the tracks, I think we're in the process of naming some of the tracks, and we're hoping to put more names back into the landscape.
Thanks for that, Darren. It's fantastic to hear that, and reinforcing it for us on the priority and of some of this work. Fiona, did you want to elaborate a bit more from our side of things why this is important for Bank Australia?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's we've recognised from the outset, I guess, community engagement and finding ways to engage the communities around our reserves was always central to the reserve. And I guess during the phase of tree planting, that was one way, but it has been of greater importance in, I guess, the second phase over the last sort of 5 or 6 years to really think about, we know so much, and conservation experts that we've worked with have known so much, but it became much more critical to actually try and understand, what are the traditional ways of caring for land. And I think that has grown along with our own commitments to reconciliation, but also, it is I guess for us a way of the land and our reserve being used and being open and being part of the community and being part of knowledge building. So that's been incredible to see. And the day of the first cultural burn was emotional for me. I can't even, I can't imagine what it may have been like for the traditional owners, but I think for us, it's another really tangible, like doing on the ground tangible things that can create some connections and can, help us with this really big project.
So just to pick up on what both Fiona and Darren there mentioned around burning and the multifaceted role, I guess, of traditional burns. It was only 18 months ago that Australia endured the worst bushfire season in recorded history, and we weren't spared from it. We had a small bushfire on the conservation reserve, and just over to you, Fiona, on how that sort of changed our fire management practices.
Well, look, I mean, first of all, it's kind of the conservation reserve burning is our worst nightmare and is the biggest risk that we have to manage as owners of the reserve. So we were lucky that in this case, so this was a fire that started by lightning. It ended up burning about 2 hectares, which is, significant enough, but not, it could have been a whole lot worse. And really, it was only not worse because of the incredibly fast response from our neighbours and the local CFA who saw the smoke and got there and were able to put the fire out very quickly. I guess it has sparked, while fire was always the #1 risk that we managed, it has really sparked a redoubled focus on those local connections. We've done a whole lot of improvements in terms of tracks. We've cleared some more tracks. We've created, proper like revised maps, policies, procedures, all the things that you would expect. But I think it's also helped us think more holistically about how we're going to manage these properties in the future and how can fire and fire prevention be part of the conservation piece. And the traditional burns are certainly species. And I think we've just needed to become a whole lot more sophisticated and learn a lot more. And it is, again, through the local partnerships that we've been able to do this. And I'm sure Fiona or Darren would be able to, speak from the local perspective on this.
So and it means that we're planning a lot more proactively than perhaps we were at first. So just a few weeks ago, Trust for Nature and Greening Australia met with CFA and BGLC to discuss where the next Indigenous burns might be able to occur in the next winter season. Obviously, we're coming into summer and the next fire season when we just cross our fingers and hope for the best. But we're certainly being more proactive and larger in our areas as we progress through. And the other really exciting thing about cultural burning is it gives us the opportunity to do things like remove biomass from those really weedy plants that Fiona mentioned, which enables us to both manage them better, but also cultural burning often results in a better species mix over time. It promotes Indigenous plants over exotic plants often, not always, but often. So we'll be monitoring that as time goes on, hopefully also in conjunction with BGLC after they've done the cultural burn, to see the conservation changes over time as a result of this. Did you want to add something, Brendan?
Oh, look, I think it's probably nothing.
So moving on then, I remember going to the private land conservation conference whenever that was last held pre-pandemic, maybe a couple of years ago now. And I remember something that really stuck with me was a chart that a speaker had shown to show how minimal the uptake in private land conservation has been in Australia relative to other countries. Just maybe we'll just go around to everybody. Like, why do you feel that private land conservation is important to complement, I guess, public land conservation? Maybe we'll start with you, Brendan.
Look, I wear a couple of hats when answering this question, Jared, as well as being with Greening Australia. I'm also the chair of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, which Fiona's CEO has been an absolute champion of for, you know, our entire existence as an informal alliance to an incorporated organisation in the last 24 months, as BA has been a very good supporter of that. Bank Australia has been a very good supporter of ALCA as well. And our current members are the likes of the Nature Conservancy, the largest conservation organisation in the world, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, Bush Heritage, Biodiversity Conservation Trust, New South Wales, Nature Foundation SA, Queensland Trust for Nature, a Tasmanian Land Conservancy. So we effectively represent some of the largest environmental NGOs in the country, but we're just a fraction of the amount of organisations and individuals that are doing private land conservation. But what I can tell you is that it's growing, and it's growing a lot, and it's growing as connections and communications and engagement, and hence the reason why we hold the conference each year at ALCRA, or try to hold it this year. It's a summit, online summit, because for reasons that everyone would understand. Is I think we're finding that as we connect people a whole lot better, we're finding that there's a lot of really good stories out there, and there's a lot of really, really good stuff happening. And while I wish the circumstances were different, that we weren't in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, we weren't in the, what I hope is the tail end of the pandemic, and we weren't 12 months on from the worst bushfires in our known history. I wish the circumstances were different, but I'm actually really excited about the future. And I think that most of the positive gains, and yes, I am a bit of an optimist, but most of the positive gains will come from private land conservation, because that's where most of the degradation is occurring. It's where has occurred. It's where most of the threats to the jewels in the crown exist, such as our beautiful national parks and our beautiful coastal systems, et cetera, et cetera. And I also think that you've got organisations and individuals with a lot of skin in the game. You know, we just heard Darren speak there before about the importance of culture and community. And then we talk about private land conservation. What I really think about is the role of stewardship, and the role that private land conservationists, in this instance a bank, but this bank represents its members, many of whom are on this call today, is very, very passionate, not just about knowing that the bank is doing the right thing, offsetting its emissions every year, et cetera, but that they are making long-term changes to the way their business runs and in conservation for the long term. And that's what land stewards do. We've got 60,000 years of continuous history that we know of in Australia by our Aboriginal people. And, you know, the private land conservationists of 2021, in my mind, are just a continuation of what we have been doing for a long time in this country. So it is really important. As I said there before, I believe most of the gains that we've got in the challenges ahead will come from private land conservation. better connectivity between the various stewards that practice private land conservation, better incentives is really important for landholders, because most of the benefits which accrue from private land conservation will help the landholder in some sense via increased agricultural productivity or a more profitable enterprise. But so many of the benefits actually accrue off the enterprise. Clean air, clean water, clean land that we benefit from as individuals actually comes from the practice, the management that people are doing on their land. So I really believe very strongly in incentives. And again, from a private land point of view, many of the unique plants and animals found on private land are simply not represented in a national park system anymore, particularly those on viable agricultural lands, which also are providing food, fibre and employment for people and community members. So as I said there earlier, the national parks are our jewels in the crown, but they are under threat from degradation and fragmentation. Places like the Tasmanian Midlands, which Tasmania is one of the purest places on earth. But if you drive that corridor between Launceston and Hobart, you will see a very, very fragmented landscape that's a real threat to those World Heritage areas. So it's about treating some of the risks at the source, but it's also about respecting that the private land estate has some incredible values. Conservation is one of them, but agriculture, employment, and regional prosperity is the other, and a healthy landscape supported by those stewards. Obviously, you can tell, Jared, I'm pretty passionate about this. Private land conservation supported by those stewards who are providing benefits back to the broader community. We need to see more of them. Need to be rewarded and recognised, and for their efforts.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point around like decentralising, I guess, the efforts and getting more people involved as well. Thanks for that. Did you want to add to that, Fiona Copley?
Yeah, and I guess I should declare a vested interest as well, in that I work for Trust for Nature, and private land conservation is what we do. So I naturally think it's really, really special. But I was really excited to work for Trust for Nature because of the private land conservation, and because that is a really special space to work in. Most of our threatened species actually occur on private land. And so by conserving private land, we're conserving our threatened species. It's so important in so many ways, and the bank does it spectacularly well because they do it strategically. And as I said before, they help make corridors and core blocks of vegetation. Private land conservation really gives landholders the ability to have their own national park, which means they can manage it spectacularly well. Often our public land lacks resources. They're reliant on funding that might not be there to do things like manage weeds. When we talk about conservation, a lot of people assume that we're just locking it up and leaving it, is the big catchphrase, when in fact, private land conservation is about managing that land. It's about ensuring that we look after the weeds to make sure we're slowly eradicating them over time as much as we can. We're managing rabbits, we're managing foxes, and a whole host of other threats to our biodiversity on private land. And it's often private land that makes the links between the large blocks of public land. So there's large gaps between the different sections of Little Desert. We try and promote biolinks between Little Desert and the Grampians, and then the Grampians through the Victorian Midland type national parks. And all of this is on private land. This is land that individuals own and manage for conservation. And because it's theirs, their whole heart is in it. And it's fantastic to see, both because people then engage with their land, they see the values, they're fascinated by the history of the land, because the history really shapes what condition the land is in now. And you can completely see it. I know of a block where 100 years ago people camped and they rode in a bullock wagon to their campsite. And 100 years later, despite the fact it's never been touched since, you can still see those bullock wagon tracks through the bush. What we do has such implications for the future. So yeah, private land conservation is the space for people to be in, really, because this is what's going to protect our future generations from climate change, And it's going to ensure that those species are still around for people to see. In my lifetime, I've seen so many threatened species decrease in population size. And I fear extinction. This is why I got into conservation in the first place. And it's just exciting to think that because of private land conservation, our children's children will have a shot at still seeing these species in the wild.
Thanks for that, Fiona. And just a shout out to everybody that the next private land conservation conference will be in Sydney, scheduled for March. So we'll see how that goes.
Jared, could I add one thing? And I will put a banker's hat on for a moment. You know, I think the other thing that I am also very positive and very hopeful, like Brendan is, about private land conservation, because I think in the world of ESG, or, you know, environmental social governance, that is growing in the private sector and companies, and particularly in financial institutions and insurers. Everybody is really waking up to the risk associated with biodiversity loss and ecological system loss. And, you know, as soon as you put people who take risks seriously, when they start looking at these issues through a risk hat, that is also, I guess, the other side of the incentives that Brendan's talking about. So mitigating risk drives action, as so does incentives. And, you know, we've always been very keen to talk about what we're doing in the hope that we would see a flurry of other Australian companies, you know, following our lead. And I guess we've been generally fairly disappointed in that. However, in the last, I would say, 2.5 years, I have spoken to a growing number of companies, and I'm getting approached a lot more often to come and talk to people about what we're doing. We also actually had a first gathering earlier this year with a range of stakeholders from land councils, private sector, government, to actually talk about trying to spark more private land conservation. And I know that a couple of companies are quite close to announcing, who have actually purchased reserves and are very close to announcing those, which is just, you know, very gratifying and really, really important.
Absolutely, really important point to make. Thanks, Fiona. So we'll stick with you, Fiona, for a bit, just to give us a bit of a summary of what's next for our reserve. Thank you.
So I know that you didn't know this, but today is actually a really, really exciting day for us, for Bank Australia and all of our partners, because we have actually spent our time in lockdown in various cities wisely. And we've actually purchased a new property for our reserve. And the significance of this is not to be understated. So we have just settled on a purchase of an amazing property called Salvano. And Salvano has been looked after by conservation volunteers, Australia and New Zealand, for the past decades. They've done an incredible job of restoring this very large property over time, and so we are extremely proud and you know, quite humbled to be able to take on the guardianship of Salvano from CVA and continue their legacy on this incredible property. So Salvano is, and I'm going to get my hectare numbers wrong if I don't look at my little notes here. Salvano will take our total conservation reserve to 2,117 hectares, effectively doubling the size of the land that we now own and will protect forever for conservation purposes. There's a lot of really incredible things about Salvano. So one is, you can see on the map there that it is within a sort of 15-minute drive of one of our other properties, Wimmera. Perhaps Fiona can talk about this more, and I'm sure she will, but the significance of Salvano is that it is one of those key connecting properties To the green property that you can see to the left and the right is actually the Little Desert National Park. And so Salvano plays that one of those, it is a really key role in trying to form the connections that Fiona was talking about. It also is home to some really rare and threatened species, and the malleefowl is one of those incredible species that I know we will be able to help and that we will be focused on. It's a different land, even though it's only 15 minutes away. It's very different land, and you know, I can see Darren nodding too. He could also probably tell you, well, I know that you can weigh a lot more than I can. So we're starting to bring Salvano into our family over the next, you know, period of time. And for our customers, this represents a, you know, a significant, you know, uplift in the reserve that they own. But on a more serious note, it is we feel that is our response to, you know, the growing urgency and crisis that we see to respond to climate change in the ways that we've talked about earlier, but also to do more on the front of ecological breakdown and protection of biodiversity. And we're just completely over the moon to be able to do this at this time. And, you know, I think it does illustrate another tangible way that we're putting our money and resources and our customers' passion and desire for us to do this work for the long term, and to demonstrate that in a very real way. I haven't actually, because we have been locked down, none of us at Bank Australia, except for Jared, briefly have actually seen the property or been able to visit it yet, which is very, very frustrating for us. So I'd love it if perhaps Darren and Fiona could give people just a little bit more flavour of Salvano and what it means for Habitat 141 and the communities in the Wimmera.
Yeah, and as Fiona said, I'm so excited by the connection it makes between the central and western blocks of Little Desert. And it means an enormous amount for conservation of those species. It means there's a pathway between those two blocks for things like the malleefowl to safely get through. There are threatened species, which is really special in this section and all across to Western Australia. I don't know if you want me to talk about malleefowl. I could for hours, but I won't. But yeah, it means it's really special because there are large old trees there. It was rolled some years back, over several decades. In that original photo, there are some degraded areas, and that's why having the bank as an owner is so valuable, because it means that they'll be able to continue that work of revegetating and increasing the habitat value of the property. But it has a really good start because it adjoins those strong vegetation areas. And as you can see from this photo, it's coming back spectacularly well. There's Xanthorrhoea, which are home to a whole lot of really special fungi, which are really important for the overall diversity of the property. It means, yeah, there's soil health, there's small ground covers, there's grasses coming back through. And it means that also the hydrology of the area, the way the water runs through the landscape, is a lot more protected and will keep recharging the aquifers that we rely on for so much of our agriculture as well. And I think Darren's seen it. I'd love to hear his thoughts on it from his perspective as a traditional owner.
No, I haven't actually been out there yet.
Oh,
but we do lots of work with Parks Victoria. We do lots of work with Parks Victoria in the Little Desert. And, like I was saying before, it's really important to get out and the Little Desert. Yeah, that's, like I said, it's really important to get traditional owner knowledge back into these places about how to and work with everyone to continue conserving it. So I think it's really exciting that this place has been added to the Bank Australia Reserve.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd like to add is the traditional owner knowledge absolutely shapes the way we manage these reserves. So in Wimmera, there's been a significant area identified that was a wetland, and someone in the past had put a dam in that area, a small one, and we've managed to find the funds, because it's quite an expensive exercise, to rehabilitate that area, to push the dam in, and hopefully that will change the hydrology back to the way it was before white settlement, and will prolong the life of those culturally significant trees. And we're prioritising that area because of the knowledge the traditional owners have now given us.
Thanks, Fiona. And I guess our first steps on Salvano is to do some of that work to understand what is there. Obviously, there is already a lot of documentation about the fauna and flora and species, but one of our very first activities will be to do the cultural heritage survey and start to build our plans around all of those data sets in the same way as we've done on the other properties. So yes, it is the start of the next era for our reserve. And I know we've got heaps of questions, and we've probably gone over because we're so excited. So
yeah, thank you everybody. If you've got any other questions, feel free to get in touch with us on our socials. So we've only got about 6 or 7 minutes left, so we'll just address maybe a few questions in different themes, if that's all right. There's a number of questions around carbon markets and how we can engage with carbon markets through our reserve properties. Did you want to start on that one, Brendan?
Yeah. Look, one of the things I'll say is that I'm a big supporter of market-based approaches because they will assist with driving scale. And impact in the scientific world is change of status or change in life condition, and markets are of a sufficient size and quantum that they can actually, change status or change life and condition, particularly with the permanence period of about 25 years. We've had an ongoing discussion with the bank. One of the things that our organisation has established in the last 5 years is a carbon business. So while we are Greening Australia, we have a carbon business that sits underneath us called biodiverse carbon, which specialises in the environmental plantings methodology, which is biodiversity oriented environmental plantings. And we look to fund a lot of our restoration effort these days through carbon markets, etc. So we'll probably triple in size over the next couple of years, which is a good news story, putting more trees back in the landscape under that biodiversity or environmental plantings methodology. So lots of really good opportunities with market-based approaches. However, what's unique about the Bank Australia approach is this is not driven exclusively by carbon market opportunities. Carbon credits are effectively a financial product, but the restoration and the conservation that's happening on the existing property and the one that's just been announced. Congratulations, Fiona, and everyone at the team. I know we haven't wasted any time. Adam and Jess were out there yesterday. They are just by managing it for conservation values, improving carbon storage and biodiversity without the production of carbon credits. So you don't have to have a carbon credit to get carbon benefits. But equally, the other thing I'd say is, while a big supporter of market-based approaches to drive real scale for impact, is you still need traditional approaches to do things that aren't funded by markets. And Bank Australia weren't incentivised to do this back in 2008 because of carbon credits. They were incentivised because they knew it was the right thing to do. And now what we're seeing is the rise of environmental markets to drive the scale. But you need a portfolio of approaches, Jared. Carbon credits is just one of them. But there's no silver bullet. We need a multitude of approaches, and it would be remiss of me not to say this with Trust for Nature on the call. You also need to have permanent protection forever, and that's where the covenanting piece comes into it, locking things up forever.
Great, thanks for that, Brendan. And in the interest of time, maybe I'll just ask one more question just around access to the reserve. So people are asking to First Nations people have access for cultural purposes, and how can customers or the public engage with the reserve or investments in the reserve? Perhaps Fiona, if you'd like to mention the wetlands project, or Fiona, either Fiona. Sorry, you're on mute. Yep.
So the wetlands project in the culturally significant area.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was what I was speaking about just before, where we're getting rid of a dam. Often dams hold water from rainfall, which seems obvious, but when you consider the amount of water in a dam and imagine that spread across a natural wetland, it really changes the way we manage water if we can remove dams. Often that's not possible. In this case, it is. So it means we're going to be able to really protect those heritage trees, we hope, using natural rainfall in a natural little wetland area, which had been altered in the past, and we're hopefully going to be changing it back. With regards to access, there pre-COVID that we've had an open day annually that anyone can come along to through the bank or Spring into Nature. We have discussed getting customers up through the bank previously, and that's something that we'll certainly keep looking at. And yeah, and traditional owners are always welcome. We've recently renamed tracks. We had a Indigenous trainee who helped us with naming tracks using Indigenous language, which was approved by the Indigenous language group that's local to this area. And so that's really exciting, and I'm hoping my knowledge of Indigenous language will improve by trying to learn to use these new track names. And anyone else who wants to come along on our open days.
Thanks, Fiona. And that's the thing, isn't it? Like we've got the option to use First Nations language, then we're going to learn it and celebrate it. We're right on one now, so I won't hold everybody up. Thank you so much for participating, everybody who's signed in, and our panelists as well. We're really excited about this. We know that we've got a big challenge ahead of us as a community, as a society, to try and turn this ship around on the climate and ecological crises. And yeah, we're asking you to work with us on trying to shift the banking sector to be a leader on that. Yeah, thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.